So look, the distinction is between the ability to pay and the willingness to pay.
Yep.
So there's always the ability to pay.
You wouldn't mind actually going into the story of your experience with the Italian government, because that seems to be a defining moment in how you put together your description of modern monetary theory.
Yeah, it's written in the book, so I can't deviate from it too much. But a situation in the marketplace where you could borrow lira from the Italian banks at maybe 10% and buy Italian government bonds, same maturity as short term at maybe 12%. You could make 2% for doing nothing. Now, if the currency went down, you still make the same 2% profits in lira, but wouldn't be worth quite as much. But it was still money for nothing, so to speak. However, the risk was that you borrow the lira, invest in government bonds, and the government would default, and then you'd be stuck with the loans and not have any bonds and take a massive loss. Okay? So the idea was we could come up with some reason why they weren't going to default, which would be counter to what everybody else was saying, including mainstream economists like Rudy Dornbush, who had done volumes on why Italy was going to default. We'd come up with some reason that's wrong, then you had a good investment in these bonds, and you can make a good return for your investors. So that's what kicked off the thinking in that direction. Okay. So when I started thinking about it, of course, so now I had reason to think about something I hadn't had reason to think about before. Why Italy ran in that default. Well, Italy had its own currency, floating exchange rate, the lira. And I checked to see if with the rating agencies, if any country with that floating exchange rate had ever defaulted before. And the answer was yes, they had. They had like 6 defaults. One of them was Japan in 1943, owed the United States government yen and didn't pay it. It's like, okay, I understand that. And then they had some Latin American defaults where the inflation was so high that the amount owed on the bonds was so tiny that nobody bothered to redeem the bonds, because you might have a zillion pesos worth of bonds, which is worth 23 cents or something. So technically it was a default on 23 cents. One of the interesting defaults they all brought up was that when the U.S. went off the gold standard, they considered that a U.S. government default because we had a promise to redeem the money for gold, and we didn't. So the U.S. as far as rating agencies were concerned had defaulted. So for all practical purposes, there were no defaults, but consequently for this purposes of this investment in floating exchange rates. And then the answer is why not? And the answer they would give you is, well, because they can always print the money. And that might be true, but there haven't been any defaults, and no one has ever, quote, printed the money. So even without printing the money, there haven't been any defaults. So it occurred to me there's a more fundamental reason why they don't default. And I was sitting with my research guy, Tom Schultz, having this exact same conversation. And it just dawned on me. I said, when we buy treasury securities, it doesn't matter to us if we buy them from the Fed or from the Treasury. We send the money to the same place. So we have a wire transfer from our bank back to New York to the Federal Reserve Bank. And then we own Treasury bonds, which are just time deposit at the Fed, right? So we're shifting money from one account to another. And so it's the same. For the private sector, it doesn't matter if it's the Fed or the Treasury. But the narrative is that when you're buying from the Treasury, you're funding expenditures. When you're buying from the Fed, they're just doing that to mop up excess reserves. They offset operating factors just to support their policy at the level they think is appropriate. All right, but it's the exact same thing to the private sector, Todd. Us on our side of the ledger, it has to be the same thing. They might account for it or describe it differently on their side of the ledger, but it's got to be one or the other. And so obviously it's monetary. It's to support interest rates. It has nothing to do with funding expenditures. Treasury is not, from a standpoint of the government overall is not selling treasury securities to fund expenditures. And looking very carefully at the accounts at the Fed, which apply to all central banks, they have a saying that we've known for 20 years before that, because that's what they do. You can't do a reserve drain without doing a prior reserve add. which means
Right.
you can't get blood from a stone. You can't. The private sector can't pay for anything until the government spends the money first. And spending would be called a reserve add. And they spend money to credit reserve accounts, so they call it a reserve add. When you make a payment, they debit your account, so they call that a reserve credit. So when reserve balances go up, they call it an add, and it goes down, they call it a trade. That's just how they talk inside the Fed. That's Fed speak, for the monetary operations stuff, the staff. So they already knew that. Okay, that there's, that the looking at it from the Federal Reserve's point of view, which is an agent of Congress, which they all perfectly well understand. The whole idea of it being some kind of private company that's acting as something other than an agent of Congress is not correct. Okay? There's no validity to that narrative. And they have to add the money before they can take it out. They spend first, and then some gets paid for taxes, and some they sell treasury securities, which shifts those dollars from one account to the reserve account to a securities account. So that's all. So first comes the spending, and then comes the payment by the private sector. And at the time, we've known for 20 years that, I've been participating in it for 20 years, where on the 15th of the month, when we had to pay for the securities that we bought, the Fed would come in and do repos, which is an expenditure. They'd add the money to our accounts. I was at Bankers Trust at one point, all the other deals. They'd come in and do a reserve add. Then we had the funds to pay for the bonds. So the funds to pay for the bonds come from the Treasury. When there was a big tax payment date, they'd come in and do a repo. They'd add the funds that would then use to pay the tax. Today, they've added all those funds in advance. We call it quantitative easing, which has no effect on the macro economy. It's just part of the offsetting of operating factors that we do in advance. It's played up to be something more than that, but it is, as the data is now clearly demonstrated.
Right. After over a decade of it, nothing seems to have happened. So,
30 years in Japan.
Yeah.
And they say, well, we just need a little more time. Like, okay. Fine. So armed with that understanding is, look, the reason Italy is not, there's no default condition even on their computers, because if you look closely, they're spending the lira first. Some, they then debit, some accounts get debited for payment of taxes, and some get debited to buy securities after the fact to support the rate structure, which was 12%. And so I understood that. I talked to clients, had a few clients at the time, and it still wasn't safe to buy the Italian bonds because they didn't know that. Okay, then they could do anything. They could just announce one day they're not going to make payments, just like Japan did in 1943. Once they understand it, there'd be no reason to not do it.
Right. So you're saying that the government itself possibly didn't understand that they didn't have to default, and they could have chosen to when they didn't have to.
Right.
And that was the risk. Yeah.
Let me jump ahead. In 1998, I had left at my firm again in 1997. I had some disagreements with the trader we'd hired to do the Russian fund, and it was just a convenient time for me to step down. So I've been out of the financial markets 4 times since the end of 97, actually longer than I was in it. So, and he had a similar position on in Russian securities, Russian GKOs, they're called, against NDFs, non-deliverable force, which, same thing, Russia can always make these payments. I said, well, look, like in Italy, you need to go over there and talk to these guys so they know which buttons to push, and don't do something that.
Don't push the big red button. You don't need to, sort of.
Or worse. So
yeah.
He said, no, I don't want to do that because then the spreads will go away and I won't be able to put more of this trade on. And I go like, whatever. And that's when I left the firm. I had no patience with these guys anymore. But anyway, in 1998, August, maybe the 17th, I remember, they just all got up and walked out of the central bank. They didn't turn the lights on. And the whole, there were no transfers, nothing was made, and the bonds were all defaulted on. And all those positions went to zero, temporarily at least, until 3 or 6 months later when they walked back in the bank and pushed the buttons and made the payments. Had major losses because of this Russian default. Now, there were other circumstances like a fixed exchange rate, but they still had the option to credit the accounts in rubles and just not give you any dollars, in which case they would have defaulted on the conversion promise, but they would have made the payments, which is all the trade they had on my firm at the time, that's all they needed was to have the ruble payments be made. They didn't care about the conversion. Which is, Russia always had the ability to do it. It did it 3 or 6 months later, but
right. And you were hoping you could have gotten there and spoken to them and say, you don't have to do this before they did.
If this happens and that happens, you don't get up and walk out. You just push this button, credit the accounts, and let the conversion people negotiate what they're going to do about that. Meanwhile, you've got the ruble machine still there. You're running the country. You're paying the military. Teachers are getting paid, and you don't have a domestic disaster. So there's no practical reason to not make the payment. Everything gets worse if you don't. Everything stays good if you do, even if you have some inflation. That's just denomination. Nothing actually collapses or that. Anyway, the point there was, back in 1992 or whatever it was, Italy. And, I foresaw that I didn't want this to happen back then, of course, the first time around. And so the guys at Harvard Management, our clients there, Dave Littleman, Marie Samuels, they had contacts through Harvard and set up a meeting with the treasury in Italy, treasury secretary, assistant treasury secretary. There was Luigi Spaventa. And we went out to see him to talk about this because we wanted him to understand things before we could take that kind of risk. And so we get into his office, and I asked him, I said, okay, this is a hypothetical question, don't answer it, but why is Italy selling all these BTPs, CCTs, as they call the bonds? Is it to fund expenditures because you need to get the lira to be able to spend? Or is it because when you first spend the money from the central bank currency accounts, if you don't sell these securities, then the Fed funds rate, the interbank rate, will go to 0 when your policy rate is 12. And so the checks will clear, but you'll fail to support your interest rate. So he goes quiet because he didn't expect this. There was a big gloom and doom. They were all depressed. They had all these reports that they were doomed to default, any minute. And he looks up and he says, no, the rates won't fall to 0. They'll fall to 0.5% because we pay interest on reserves of 0.5%. We had a support rate. I didn't know that because it wasn't material, which is the same thing we do now, by the way. We picked up,
right.
But they were way ahead of us. So, and I said, okay, they'll fall to 0.5%. And then he just jumps up in this, epiphany, or he goes into this rant about, he's wearing a 3-piece suit, and he had a pipe, and he spoke British English. So it was very much looking like Keynes or something, right? And very astute guy. And obviously he knew monetary operations because somebody else would have known what I was talking about. So fortunately, we got a guy who was good. He was, he knew his stuff. So he gets up and he starts going into a rant against the IMF and how they're making them act pro-cyclical and austerity and the whole thing, when it's just a reserve trade. The whole thing is nonsensical. And, all of a sudden the doom and gloom is totally gone. And it was supposed to be a 20-minute meeting, and he starts calling in people from the other offices nearby, and they come in, and we explain it to them, and they start making us cappuccino. They had this big, huge cappuccino machine that the government must have spent a whole ton on. And, 2 hours later, we finally snuck out to our next meeting. And a week later, the announcements came out of Italy. No extraordinary measures will be taken. All payments will be met on time. And the crisis part went away. The rates were the same. They came down eventually because they decided to. But they made all their payments, and life went on without any default risk. And spreads eventually went back to normal, to 0. It took a year or two as they drifted lower and lower. And anyways, we then felt comfortable owning these securities because they did know which buttons to push and how it worked. And it was a good investment for our investors. To make good returns on that for that year.
So it just cracks me up whenever I hear this.
Yeah.
But I mean, both from the Italy story and unfortunately the Russia story is not a crack up because they didn't push the buttons. But it's just in a situation like this, it's just button pushing, right? And everybody makes this huge ordeal out of it. And, oh my God, we're going to default, and the sky's going to fall, and blah, blah, blah. It's like, just push this button, we're fine.
Yeah. Well, what about the debt ceiling? That's just a political constraint. The U.S. could have very easily defaulted. So look, the distinction is between the ability to pay and the willingness to pay.
Yep.
So there's always the ability to pay. That's our point at Montemonte theory. Because it's more than that. If you're spending first and then that money gets used to pay taxes. Like the ability to pay is not even like it's not part of the.
Well, and that actually leads us.
It's not applicable.
that actually leads us right into your first 7 Deadly Innocent Fraud, and then that's the name of Warren Mosler's book, 7 Deadly Innocent Frauds of Economic Policy. So, but we're going to go over the 7.
Oh, and it's free. It's free online. You just download it and read it. It's fairly short. So no excuses.
Yeah, it's quick. It's quick, good, and easy. It's not economic gobbledygook. It's really understandable.
It's totally non-technical.
Just one quick thing I wanted to interject before we get there. It sounds like from that Italian story that you told us, which was in the 90s, that was before the Italians were forced to adopt a different currency, the euro, correct?
Yes.
And so at the time, we can see here that the individual European countries still had a sense of fiscal sovereignty, and you could actually go to one of them and talk to them.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, fundamentally what has changed in the European Union, because today they've sort of lost that sense of independence to the euro, basically, and the people who are in charge of the euro. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's almost like the U.S. states went through. First was the Articles of Federation. The states were in charge. Then they turned it over to the federal government under the Constitution. And today, if New York State's having a problem, unemployment is higher there for some reason, price of oil went up, they can't just go out and run countercyclical deficit spending or anything else. They rely on Congress.
Right.
And so the European Union, the way to think about it is that Italy, Germany, they've turned themselves into what are like U.S. states, Connecticut, Florida, and it works. There's nothing wrong with that. Okay, but you're then relying on the central government for fiscal policy. And
it works if there is an agreement that if we run into trouble in these in certain states, the only source of extra spending of net private savings is the federal government and not the state government.
So if you look at last year, Italy ran a deficit of 11% of GDP because the European Commission, the finance ministers had decided that that's appropriate. So they now understand explicitly, but they may have understood all along, that the 3% deficit limit is now a policy tool. And if you think it's better, that as long as you decide you want it to be 11, it can be 11. You're not going to bounce checks. The spreads aren't going to widen out. As long as the central bank is guaranteeing the debt through the do what it takes to prevent default. And since they didn't write it down, they reinforce it by buying some of their bonds. If they write it down, they wouldn't have to buy any of their bonds. They'll have to zero anyway. Just think about that. If the European Central Bank guaranteed your debt, personally, how many euros could you borrow? Quite a bit.
Right.
Pretty good interest rate too, right? So minus 0.5%. So they've got the guarantee from the central bank. They're under the umbrella, and the limit's a policy tool. The same way it is here. Congress decides. In the same way now, we've got Congress deciding we have to have a lower deficit. They may decide they have to have a lower deficit, but it's just, the analogy is is pretty good. Now, the political channels are entirely different. And the democratic controls, if you want to call it that, the representation is entirely different. But
economically speaking, it's
we elect members of Congress who make these rules. They don't do that. They elect the European Parliament, but they don't make these rules. This is the European Commission or the appointed people make these rules. Central banks not appointed by the European Parliament. There's no direct electoral process. But at the end of the day, I'm not sure how much that matters. I mean, I like the sound of it, that you get to elect your officials, but how important that is, I'm not sure. If you look at where the material control comes from, you've got lobbying groups, and you've got special interests, and you have people being threatened behind the scenes.
Right.
You get the usual human drama going on. That's probably more of a factor than a lot of people realize.
Everyone, please like, comment, and subscribe to help us grow this channel. I think we cover a lot of good stuff. We're covering ideas that you're not hearing anywhere else. Economic ideas, historical ideas, systematic politics ideas you're not hearing anywhere else.